Good morning. Thank you for inviting me and my family to Greece, this lovely country of yours, our first trip here. I brought two of my daughters and my son with me, and we're having a great time. Thank you so much. It's a wonderful place to be, but I'd like to start off by talking about a less wonderful place to be, so forgive me. I'd like you all to imagine that you're back at work right now. You're not at this wonderful place. And while you're back at work, there's a production outage. Something went down. You have no idea what. But your boss is calling you, telling you, you need to fix this. She says it's important that you fix it right away. So you drop everything and you start debugging. It's a weekend. You're like, why do I have to do this? Nothing's working. Your business is getting really frantic and worrying about things. The problem here is you end up finding a line of code with a really interesting comment. It says, "Dear developer." Okay, this is weird. If you're reading this, there might be an outage. Yes, there is. We found that our logs, when they're full, can crash the server. Make sure you leave this line of code in place. If you removed it, put it back. Now. And then you see something like this that looks a little cryptic. Not exactly very clear. Is this a good comment? Did it help you fix the problem? Or is it just really silly? Well, that's what we want to talk about today. So could we have solved this problem, this series of unfortunate events, which caused us to ruin our weekends, to have to go to work and try to figure out what was wrong? So my name's John Papa, and again, thank you for having me here today. I'm a developer at Microsoft. I'm a web developer. And I want to talk about readable code to you. It's something that means a lot to me, and I think a lot of you will be able to resonate with this. All of our lives, we talk about, with our family and friends, what do you do for a living? Do you write code or do you read code? What do you tell your family? I write code. But do you? Our little secret in this industry is that we spend most of our time reading code. Wouldn't you agree? You spend more of your time looking at someone else's code, the code your friend wrote, your colleague, somebody in another office, code that you wrote, trying to figure out what you did yesterday. What was I thinking when I wrote this? Trying to figure out what it all means. And the ratio by different studies of how much time we spend writing code versus reading, we spend 10 times the amount of time reading our code than writing it. 10 times. So when you tell your friends that you write code, you're lying. I'm lying. It means we're actually reading code more often. That's what we do for a living. For example, have you ever been inside of your office and you've done a code review? And you're hearing all these different things coming out of people doing a code review. And maybe they're nice things, maybe they're not so nice. The number of if you get a lot of those, that means that's not such good code. If you get just a few, that's okay. It's because we're reading our code. We're trying to see, can somebody else read your code? Can we communicate? It's not about being clever or crafty or artful. It's about communication. Communication. Can you understand the person's code next to you? Can you understand your own code? Don't tell me that none of you have ever written code where you didn't understand what it did a week later. And you're looking back going, man, I think I was drinking or something. I don't know what happened. So how do we make sure our code can be readable? So in this case, we want to worry about the developer behind us. That developer behind you might be someone very caring. They might be somebody who's, just hanging out, looking out for you, or that developer might be somebody a little more violent. If that developer behind you has to support your code, you don't want them chasing you down because they couldn't figure out what you did. You want to care about that developer behind you. You want to make sure that developer is taken care of because that could be you. It could be you. So caring about your craft is a very good thing. A lot of us really do software engineering because we care about it. We love what we do. We're passionate about writing software. But caring what happens after you write your code is beautiful. After you write your code, if your thing is in production for years and years and it can live for a long time and other people can keep it alive, that's beautiful. Otherwise, you end up supporting the same thing your whole life. That's not so good. So let me show you some charts here. Over time, the level of productivity that you have in your app when you don't take care of your code can be really messy. The cost of that mess is over time, you lose all your productivity. And eventually, you end up in a state where you think about rewriting the entire application because you can't figure out what the code's doing anymore, and you have to make changes to it. And eventually, it comes to one of these conclusions. This might make you and your team very happy. Yay, we get to use the newest version of Vue or Angular or React. It makes everybody really happy. Your boss might not be so happy. They're like, what are you talking about? What do you mean we have to rewrite this code? So who is the code intended for? Do we write code for us? For the computers? For other people? We write code to be read by people, but to be processed by machines. So people have to read our code. Machines will do whatever it says, but we have to be able to read the code. So how do we do this? Well, when we're looking at our code, one of the important things I like to think about is you don't know who's going to be looking at it next. Sometimes you think it's the person next to you. Sometimes it might be you, but it could be anybody. You have no idea who might be peeking out at your code. So because you don't know that, it's important to make sure that it's clear no matter who's there. When I used to work at my last job, I wrote an application that had to be supported. It was written by 150 developers. It had to be supported by 1,000 developers. I could not take myself and put myself at every person's chair, at every desk around the world, and tell them how the code worked. That would have been easy for 1 or 2 people. It's not so easy for 1,000. So how do you write code that anybody can pick up and read? That's the point of today. Here's some tips. First, start with a style guide. Everybody has their own style of coding. I wrote one for the Angular team for writing AngularJS and the new versions of Angular, and it's just a guide. It's not a rule. You don't need to have rules at your company for writing code, but you do need to have some kind of a guide. Put down the conventions that you all agree on. Sit together. And the most important thing about a guide is to make sure the guide not only tells you what to do, but why. Why do we do it this way? If you can't answer why, then you probably shouldn't be doing it. It can't just be because John says so. It has to be because there's a reason. What is the benefit of this? So writing a guide often helps everybody get on the same page. Using meaningful names is another thing. We all know how to do math. We could write a function that divides x by y and returns the value. But wouldn't it be a little more readable to read this code quicker if we write the full names out? Say, we're going to divide the dividend by the divisor, and it comes out with a quotient. We'll return that. When we use quick abbreviations, they might resonate with me, but they might not make sense to you. So meaningful names are very important. For example, these are very readable. We're going to remove an entity. We're going to dispatch to get our heroes. Very clear communication. One of my favorite rules in my house is called the 5-second rule. If a cookie drops to the floor, you have 5 seconds to pick it up before it's officially dirty and it has to go in the garbage. I like to apply the same rule to my code. If you have code like this, and I'm going to give you all a quiz now, you have 5 seconds to read and think about, what does this code do? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, that was kind of quick. It wasn't very legible, but the same code could be written like this. Now, the code's very readable. What is the function? It's getting sessions. And then we're calling our service to get our sessions. We're going to map the result, log out the errors, and show a toast message. Very clear and readable. Somebody else can look at this code and know what's happening. There's another concept that's been around for years in the marketing industry, in the newspapers, called above the fold. Above the fold is a very common concept which helps you figure out when you're reading news, people will pay ads for putting their ads on top of the fold, above the fold. If you go to a website, your favorite websites pay for information to be on the main screen so you don't have to scroll to it. When we have to scroll, that takes energy, and a lot of times we don't. So the most important code should go up top. Whatever is most important should be in the top of your files inside your code. You want to look for signs of readability or maybe code that isn't readable. So let's talk about some of those as well. You want to organize your code for readability. And that, again, could be a part of a style guide that you do. Most important things go up top. I try to keep things together. Some people like to put properties first and then have methods after them. Whatever your sequence is, that's fine. Just pick one and have a guide that helps you get there. It doesn't matter what the choice is as long as you all agree at your team that this is readable. Smaller functions are more readable. A common thing I heard at large companies was, John, we can't figure out what our code does. Or, John, we can't test our code. I'd say, why? Well, they say, we can't test it because we can't figure out exactly what it does. Why can't you figure it out? Well, because there's a lot of logic. Well, how much logic? There's about 2,000 lines of code in each function. Why is there 2,000 lines of code in each function? Because it does a lot of things. Why does it do a lot of things? You can sense where this is going. Keep asking why. Well, because it does a lot of things, because there's a lot of if statements, there's a lot of for loops, a lot of switch case. Why does your function need all of those things? Why not break up that 2,000 line code into smaller bite-sized pieces? A lot of little functions might make it more readable to do each step. Eliminate comments that you don't necessarily need. So now, instead of this longer function, which is relatively readable, to update a speaker, it's going to add and update a speaker. I would say, why are we doing two things in this module? Why not have a function called add speaker and have a function called update speaker? And then our code can call both of those when they need it. Smaller functions are much more consumable, much easier to test, and much more likely to get updated and maintained as small functions. When you see a clean room, are you likely to throw your trash on the floor? No, you want to keep it clean too. Very nice place here. Looks good. If we walked in here and the room was full of trash on the floor, would you even think about throwing another piece of garbage on the floor? Probably not. You probably would, because there's a lot of it there. When you see clean code, people tend to like to keep it that way. If it's already a mess, what's another 20 lines of code going to do? Small code is also ideal for serverless functions. We talk about the cloud a lot these days. You can create code on a server, or you can create them in the cloud. And these serverless functions have a great advantage because we don't have to maintain servers. We don't have to figure out how to configure it. We just write our functions and put them in the cloud. And it's never been more important for clean, small code as it is with serverless functions. So serverless functions, we might have a function like this, which goes out and gets our code. We're reading a module to get our people service. That code's in another file that figures out how to get the people. And then this function gets those people, formats the response, and returns it. We're separating the code out. So even when we're using serverless, like Azure Functions or AWS Lambda or Google Cloud Functions or Heroku's, all these things can be using clean code and readable code. So some of the advantages here, you can reuse your functions when they're smaller, makes it more readable, makes it easier to test and to debug. The thing I look for is sharing those services. Those are your advantages. The one thing you need to be careful of is when you break things into smaller functions, you still need to be able to test the performance to make sure you haven't affected it, which shouldn't be a problem, but it's always good to look. And the other is, if you create smaller functions, it's harder to do smaller functions across projects than it is inside of your project. You don't want to have up 7 projects to look at your code. So it is one caveat to look at and be careful. So serverless functions are a great use case for readable code. Anytime you want to have a collection of related functions or a library, or basically microservices. They're called micro on purpose. Lots of tiny, small, very focused, readable code. So less than 20 lines is one of my favorite rules of thumb. It doesn't have to be a rule, it could be a guideline again, but having less code is always good. So there could be dragons here, right? We could have really long functions. So what I like to do is have this rule of just make sure my functions are 20 lines less. Sometimes you go a little over, that's okay. But in general, I look at my code and say, why did it take so long to do this? If I have a lot of branches in my code, where I have if statements and switch cases in my code where it's taking me down 7 different pathways in one function, 7 different ways you can enter and exit. That's a lot. That's a good sign that maybe I've got too much in there. Maybe I can make that more readable. I used to work at Disney World in technology, and I loved it. One of the great things about Disney is it's very multicultural. We had people from almost every nation working in our technology departments. One of the things that was funny, a very good friend of mine was writing code and kept on seeing that one person from another country was constantly spelling certain words wrong, because that's how they spelled it in their country, but it wasn't spelled that way in English. The other people couldn't read it, and from other cultures, they couldn't read it. And they often said to me, why is this important? Why is it important that we spell all the same way in code? Pick a spelling, pick a language, and run with it. Because I saw code that looked like something like this. What happens if I say that? I love geek food. Maybe I do. But maybe I meant I love Greek food. Simple things like this can be hard to find. Why? Because you might have some code where it matters. For example, look at this code. Actual code that I saw in a project. Look a little closer. Notice how they spelled rules. That is not how you spell rules in the English language. Validate, somebody was being funny. They're like, it's supposed to be validate, like a validation function. And they spelled it as a validate. And then it's supposed to be insert a customer, not a customer. A customer is also a person, but that's not what we were looking for. And I talked to the developer who wrote this. They said, we were just being funny. I said, here's why it isn't funny. I had to go look through this code and find all the functions that had validation rules. So I looked through all the code for the word validate. And I never in my entire life would have thought of looking for a valid 8 in there. So we missed this code, we went to production, we had a bug. So while it may be funny, it's not necessarily readable and it caused problems. So spelling does matter inside your code. At some point, being too clever, while funny, isn't really useful. So picking names that actually make sense and can be searched for when we do Control F or Command F in our code, much more useful. So choose a convention with your code too. Sometimes we have functions like getting customers, and then someone else writes it and says fetch the customers. Someone else writes it, says retrieve the customers, or go get them, or give me them. Picking a convention, picking one of those makes it easier so you all have the same mindset of what they do. Doesn't matter which one you pick your favorite, and choose one. Much easier to read now. Readable code. People who maintain your code also lack your context. When you wrote the code is important. Think about when you wrote your code the last time you did something. Was somebody hurrying you to get it out the door? Was somebody really worried about a specific feature? Why did you write that extra security logic? Now, give your code to somebody else, and they look at your code. They may not know why you wrote the code the way you did. They know what it is, but they don't know why. So the context of when you write your code is really important. For example, context is clarity. If you have context, the person can look at your code and understand why you did something. So some of you may have seen this movie, little movie called Star Wars. In Star Wars, this is an amazing scene. Spoiler alert ahead. This guy here with the dark helmet, Darth Vader, says, "I'm your father." The people on the set didn't know this was going to happen. This is how amazing this was. The people didn't know it was going to happen. But now imagine you've never seen this movie, and some of you may not, and then you see, "I'm your father." And this other guy goes, "No," and he's crying, and he cuts off his hand, and he falls, and everybody thinks he's gone. And you're looking at it going, why is that important? But if you've watched Star Wars, you know that up to this point, nobody had any idea that Darth Vader was Luke Skywalker's father. And this was a huge moment in the series. Huge. But if you haven't seen it, you don't have the context, and you have no idea why that's important. Some of you have seen it, you understand it. Some of you haven't seen the movie, and you're like, yeah, so what? That's my point. You need to have your code have context, because you can't imagine everybody's going to know your mind when you wrote your code. So first, you want to provide clarity through your code. Clarity is really, really important. You can explain in code, but not comments. Your code should explain what it does. You shouldn't need this comment. Check if the hero can defeat the villain. If we wrote this code clearly and readable, we wouldn't need the comment. Instead, why not write a function called canDefeat? Hero can defeat villain. Do I need the comment any longer? No. Very simple to take that code and make it readable. Replacing magic strings with constants is another way to make code more readable. Lots of strings in here. Why not pull those out into a constant, and then you write your function using those constants, breaking things apart a little bit. Another technique. Comments must be maintained and readable. Comments are still a good thing. I don't write a lot of comments because I try to make my code readable, but they are still important. So let's talk about when they're good and when you should avoid them. When comments are good, few good situations. When you're going to explain why something works, that's a good comment. If you're explaining what it does, that means your code isn't very clear. Your code should explain what it does. Your comment should explain why it does it. Remember how I opened up and we had that comment that said, put the code back, because if you don't, the servers might crash? It didn't explain what the code did. It just said, this is what's going to happen if you remove this line of code. That scares you. It's like, okay, I'm not going to remove this line of code. What if the comment just said, check if the log is full? Okay, that tells me what it does, but it doesn't tell me how important it is that I don't remove this. So comments that explain what aren't as important. If they're outdated or incorrect, this is my biggest problem with comments. How often have you written or read a comment and then looked at the code after it, and it has nothing to do with what the code does? Happens to me all the time. I've maintained systems that were 1 year old, that were 1 week old, that were 1 day old, that had comments that were wrong. Make sure your comments get updated all the time. And sometimes when you shoulda or coulda just used a function and you named it well. Comments, you don't need that in that case. So when can comments mislead you? Look at this code. Notice the comment says, check if the hero can defeat the villain. Is that what the code's actually doing? The code's actually checking if a villain can defeat a hero. Simple word changes change the meaning of what the comment says. The code does. And you probably didn't even notice this when you first look at it. Comments are maintenance. They're technical debt that we must maintain. A gentleman on my team, Burke Holland, this great guy, he put this one up there. He says, comments never lie. Our code never lies, but comments do. Your code won't lie. Code does what it does, but your comments sometimes do. Make sure you update those. Aim for comments that capture the intent of the code, not the what, but the intentions. What did you mean to do in this case? So use comments when it explains why, or you're explaining a consequence like we saw in the beginning of the presentation. What would happen if this code wasn't here? How would this work? Would it fail? Or any API documentation, that's a good place for comments as well. So it's not that comments are bad, comments are good, but like anything, they have to be well tended, like a garden. So here's a case where comments help you. Everybody's favorite thing. A good friend of mine says, once you have a problem and you solve it with regex, you know what you have now? 2 problems. The problem and regex. Who likes to read regex? Seriously. There's always somebody. There he is. He's over there. Hire him. Regex is like, really? This will check an email. And by the way, if you Google email regex, how many do you find out there? Like 100 different variations. With a regex, the code is not readable. There is nothing you can do to make this readable. The only guy who can read it's over here. That's when you do your best with a function, and then maybe the function says it's going to validate an email, but how is it doing it or why is it doing it? Put a comment up top and say, I'm checking if the email follows this format. Well, the comment could probably go further to even say, this will also be valid if it's an empty email. There's nothing there. Maybe that's a use case. Maybe put some examples in the comment to show what kind of emails would be valid. Great use case for a comment, regex. Yeah, regex happens. We have to live with it. Always keep your comments up to date. That's our burden to maintain. Use consistent code formatting as well. How many of you have ever been in your office and you're in an argument with one of your developer friends over how many spaces you have? 2 or 4? Who likes tabs? Who likes spaces? All right. Who doesn't care? Is this the way you want to spend your day? Fighting over tabs or spaces or 2 or 4? I don't. I'll tell you what. Team code formatting wars are not fun. It just brings inconsistency, brings arguments. There's better things to talk about. One of the worst things about these arguments is your pull requests. Recently, I talked to my friend Ben Lesh. He runs RxJS, now works at Google. And there's a new feature where he was getting in Visual Studio Code where people were formatting their code differently, and it was just on a trial basis, and everybody went from 2 spaces to 4, and he's like, this is going to be awful. I'm going to get a bunch of pull requests where they make 1 line of code change, and 80 files are going to change because it went from 2 spaces to 4. And at first you kind of laugh, but that makes a lot of sense. Who wants to manage a pull request in source control with 80 file changes when really one of those was important and the rest were spaces? So how do you solve this? Things like this, you can use Prettier. There's a tool in JavaScript called Prettier. .NET and Java also have tools for this. Find a code formatting tool, sit with your team, pick your conventions, set up the Prettier style, and then put that in your code so everybody just follows it. It eliminates all the discussions, the fights, the pull request messes. It just works. Prettier is wonderful. You can use this in your favorite editor. It works in WebStorm, IntelliJ, Visual Studio, or my favorite tool, Visual Studio Code. Okay, so throughout this whole talk, I've told you a lot of things about not to do, what to do. You might be feeling a little bad, like, I do a lot of these things. Who here does at least one of the things that I talked about today? Yeah. Well, I want to tell you, you shouldn't feel bad. It's okay. Your code doesn't have to be readable to start. In fact, I recommend it's not readable when you do start writing code. It's best to be agile, to write code iteratively, get it down on the editor, put something in there, write your dirty code, then iterate and clean it. Go over it and go over it and go over it. Put it down in the function. Oh, it's too long. Let's make it smaller. Okay, now it's smaller, but I can't really tell what this particular part's doing. Maybe I need to rename the function. Maybe I need to write a comment. If I write a comment, am I going to maintain it? Ask yourself these questions when you write your code. So we write our dirty code and then we clean it. And if we do, we can come back to our code. And hopefully the next time we see one of these comments, my message to you all is, maybe you'll see something like this. When you're writing a readable code, developer, it is easier to maintain. And it might be there for the next developer. And very likely, that next developer might just be you. Here's my tips that I kind of put out today as a summary. 5-second rule. Can you read your code in 5 seconds? If you can understand what it does in 5 seconds, good, move on. If it takes you 5 minutes, that's probably a sign that you need to refactor. 1 thing per file. It's always been a good rule in pretty much every language I've worked in, Java, C#. Yes, I did COBOL. I don't know if it applies there. JavaScript, TypeScript, pretty much every language you have. 1 thing per file works really well. Keep things small. Small functions works really great for serverless. Well thought out naming. Use comments wisely. They are maintenance. They're just as important, if not more important, in your code than the code. Make your own style guide. and pick a formatting tool like Prettier for JavaScript. And if you want to get access to some of the things that will help you, here's some links up here. The first link is a way to try some serverless functions for free if you want to give it a try. If you want to use a tool that I use all the time that helps me write readable code, Visual Studio Code has a bunch of great extensions like Prettier that you can use with it for free. The Angular Essentials. I'm an Angular developer. I love it a lot. There's a great extension that I wrote up there which links in a bunch of tools that helps you write Angular code in a readable way. There's also one up there for Vue and for React. And then finally, if you like the color schemes of the code, because I always get asked at the end of my talks, what's your color scheme? What's the font? You can check out the theme that I use up there called Winter is Coming at this link. I want to thank you all for coming today, and hopefully you'll all write some readable code. Have a great conference.
Thank you, John. Finally a talk at Vox that I could understand, you know. And I can safely say that I will write better comments now. I do code here and there, and my code is terrible. And I hate it when I have to pass it on to somebody because I feel so embarrassed about the quality of the code and especially the quality of the comments. So I aim to make more readable code going forward. I think we have a few minutes for any questions. If anybody would like to raise their hand, we have a few microphones, or at least I have a microphone. I will happily sprint to you and give you my mic to ask a question of John. But I'd like you to raise your hand really high because there's so many of you, I'm not going to be able to see it.
Let's see how far you can run.
I can run pretty fast and pretty far. There you go, right in the back over there. Look at that.
There he goes. All right.
Challenge accepted. Challenge accepted.
We need some running music.
I need to be careful of the... There you go. Is that a new Microsoft game?
Okay, so hi. The remark you made for the pull request with 80 files changed touched a very sensitive nerve. So I have a question for you regarding that. Assume you're leading a team where basically you have a 6-year-old code base that is a mixture of tabs and spaces, and in order to not, drive your developers mad, you have Vim mode lines on the top so the editor understands how to format. So you sit them down and everyone says, Prettier, it's fantastic, it's amazing. Okay, we've reached that. But then, the question is this: do you do one massive pull request or commit that every single file has been prettierified, or do you do it gradually with every file you touch, then you apply the prettier command?
That's a great question. So if I understand you right, you've got a large project with a lot of older legacy code, and it wasn't consistent, but you want to be. So let's say there's 1,000 files. In fact, I hit this a lot at the companies I've been at, where there's been 1,000. In one case, there were over 20,000 files, and we had the exact same situation. And we discussed this. The problem was, by doing one massive pull request, one big merge, you're also still working on the code at the same time. So it's hard to stop, format, and tell everybody else they can't merge until you're done formatting. So that gets difficult. If you can, it only takes like a day or two, which was what we did a lot of times. We would dedicate like a cleanup day at the end of a sprint. We'd go through, we'd make sure all of our code was rebased and ready inside source control. Everybody's up to date, they've pulled recently. And if you're following good source control practices, then you and your team can grab all the code, run the Prettier tool or whatever tool you use on it, format it, make one big save, push it up, do one merge, and then everybody pulls again. Generally, we found this worked really well the first day of the next sprint. So after the end of a sprint, the first day of the next sprint that we did in Agile. Why the first day? Because the first day is when everybody's trying to figure out what they're going to do anyway. So they're not really coding a lot. So it was kind of a downtime. And the last day is never a good day because you don't want formatting to break your build. So by pulling it in there at the end, it worked. We did have some teams who did the one file at a time approach. For that, the problem there is you can format one file at a time, but you can't put the prettier tool in the code base until they're all done. And we found that teams who did it this way never finished because they never touched all the files. So they still ended up with kind of a half and half mess. So I recommend personally trying to go to that beginning of the sprint, setting aside a day, while everybody else is figuring out what they're doing, have one of the developers format the code, merge it, and everybody else pulls. Yep, good question. The microphone's not working.
No.
Now it's working.
Hello, thank you for your talk. We have seen great contribution to the community from you, so the question is what we will expect next. What is your next project that we will see? Your next contribution to the community?
From me? Project from me?
Yes, because we have seen a lot of things. What are you working now?
I do a lot of things. So what am I working on coming up soon? Right now, I'm hoping to work on a trip around Athens to see some sights. I'm actually working on, I got a couple things I got my hands in. One of them is called NGRX. It's a data state pattern tool for JavaScript with Angular. If you've done React, it's Angular's version of Redux. And the problem I have with NGRX, I often see problems, and I try to solve them. In NGRX, when you write code, it's amazing, but it takes you literally 500 lines of code to write state for one model. Now, I've worked at a lot of large companies, and some of them had 500 models. I don't want to write 25,000 lines of code to manage all that, when it's always the same thing over and over again. So my friend Ward Bell and I worked on a project called NGRX Data, and we're now trying to merge it into the NGRX team's code. Instead of writing 500 lines of code for one model, you write 2. So that's the way I like it. It's still NGRX, it just gets rid of all the boilerplate. The kind of projects I look for is when I try to help people. The Angular style guide, reducing boilerplate. I really enjoy writing code, but I enjoy the most is when other people like it. Because if I can make someone else's life easier writing code, that's what I enjoy doing. Cool.
I've got time for one more question before I let John go on his fantastic tour of the Athens metro system and the user interface. Anybody? It's your final chance.
And I want to say one thank you to all of you and to the conference organizers and the sponsors, and for my 3 children sitting in the front row who had to listen to their father talk for 45 minutes, which that's pretty good.
So today we have the youngest coder in the room is this gentleman over here. Could you stand up and get her? This is the youngest coder in the room. He's, I think, 10 years old. 10 years old. Yeah. I asked him, so what do you write? And he goes, JavaScript. I'm like, okay, respect. Thank you very much, John. Thank you.
Thank you all.